Hello, everyone, and welcome to the top 10 configuration security risks in a PeopleSoft environment. We are joined by Steve Kost from Integrigy. My name is Scott Lavery, and I am the head of marketing here at Appsian, and I'd like to thank you all for participating in the PeopleSoft Innovation Summit. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. Everyone is on mute. The session is being recorded, and we will be posting all of the recordings to the official PSFTSummit YouTube channel. So I would suggest going there. You can see the content from our last summit back in September, and then you'll be able to see all the content from this event as well. For free on-demand viewing, that should probably be posted at some point next week. Also, the session today will be around 60 minutes in length, so we will have time for Q&A. If you have any questions, you can put those in the question section of the control panel that's on the right side of your screen. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Steve to begin today's presentation. Steve?
Thanks so much, Scott. Today we're going to talk about security in a PeopleSoft environment, and we're going to focus in on mostly around infrastructure security. So we're talking about before you sign into the application. So we're going to be looking at PeopleTools, WebLogic, Tuxedo, the Oracle database, those things that are in the infrastructure that even if a malicious attacker, a hacker gets into, will circumvent all your application security controls, because there's usually a lot of focus around in a PeopleSoft environment around application security controls. How do I make sure that who's accessing the system has the appropriate privileges? But what happens if someone attempts to attack your system, attempts to break in through WebLogic directly into the database and things like that? And so we're going to really highlight those risks in the environment here, and how do you actually protect yourself, protect the overall PeopleSoft environment from an infrastructure perspective. And we're going to systematically go through some of the top 10 security risks around these infrastructure components in a PeopleSoft environment. Before we get started, a quick background from Integrigy. Integrigy is founded in 2002 by former Big Six consultants working on large ERP implementations like PeopleSoft. Back then, people weren't changing the base passwords. People didn't even know what a security patch was, and we've come a long way. But again, there's still a lot of security risks in these environments, and that's what Integrigy specializes in. How do you actually secure your Oracle e-business suite, your PeopleSoft environment, to make sure that someone malicious, a hacker, an insider can't get into the database, get into WebLogic, and actually cause mayhem and steal data, etc. Integrigy does this a couple different ways, helping our clients. We have two products, one being App Sentry, which is a security scanner and auditing tool for Oracle Business Suite and PeopleSoft. So this goes through and actually will check a lot of things that we're talking about in this presentation. It checks the database, it checks WebLogic, it checks Tuxedo, it checks PeopleTools, as well as the application. Our other product is AppDefend, which is a proactive layer of protection for PeopleSoft. So if you aren't applying security patches immediately, if you're worried about web security vulnerabilities within PeopleTools, within the PeopleSoft application, within WebLogic, AppDefend provides a layer of virtual patching to protect you from those security vulnerabilities, protect you from classes of security vulnerabilities such as SQL injection, cross-site scripting. A lot of this presentation comes from our security assessment services. So every day we're working with large PeopleSoft implementations, helping them through these security challenges. How do you actually protect these environments? We're doing security assessments. We're actually working with them how to do SOX compliance, GDPR, HIPAA, PCI. And we're also helping implement products like Oracle TD, Oracle Database Vault, third-party products like Imperv and Guardium. So enough about Integrigy. That's kind of just a brief background about where we're coming from regarding this presentation. So how do we develop this top 10 list? Well, this is mostly, again, from our security assessment. So we're, in the last 2 years, we've really focused in on PeopleSoft as one of the applications that Integrigy specializes in. And we've done a number of large assessments working with large companies who and organizations who have implemented PeopleSoft. And so we've really kind of gone through those work products and said, okay, where are the issues we're seeing over and over and over? What's the major problems that we see in many of the PeopleSoft environments that we've audited? Also, we've got a world-class research team that actually works and is trying to break PeopleSoft every day. So they're sitting in a lab, going through the PeopleSoft environment, finding security vulnerabilities, finding weaknesses, going through and say, okay, if we lock this down, how can we better secure this application? What was the criteria for the ones that actually made the list? Well, we want to be pragmatic, things that you can actually address and resolve, and things that really provide a risk of disclosure of data, loss of sensitive data. Because again, a lot of PeopleSoft environments contain very sensitive data, especially on the HR side. So we've really kind of combined this down into a very finite list of things that you really should be focusing in on first. These are the important things. So as we kind of get into this and kind of talk about the different risks in a PeopleSoft environment, let's step back real quick and look at the architecture first. So again, this is from an infrastructure perspective. So we're talking about the PIA web server. You're running WebLogic, you may be running WebSphere. We're kind of focused mostly in around WebLogic because again, that's what most PeopleSoft shops are actually running versus WebSphere. But again, most of the information that we're providing here is applicable to either WebLogic or WebSphere. We're talking about PIA, PeopleTools, the servlets running, how it actually connects to Tuxedo, the Tuxedo connection to the database. These are all the components in the infrastructure. As you can see, we're not actually talking about logging into the application. Once you log into the application, kind of this presentation stops at that point. That is more of an issue around segregation duties, application setups, and things like that. We're going to talk about those things in the infrastructure. What are the top risks in a PeopleSoft environment? So there's a number of threats. I'm not going to spend 10 slides here talking about all the threats to your PeopleSoft environment, who's trying to hack in there. I will focus in on one though, one that we're actually seeing just a major uptick, especially because of WebLogic. So everyone's probably heard of Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency. Well, there's hundreds of other cryptocurrencies. A big one is also Monero. The advantage of Monero is it's an anonymous coin. Therefore, it's very hard to track down who's buying and selling Monero. So if you're a hacker and you really want to do something, you really want Monero versus Bitcoin, because Bitcoin you can oftentimes get back to actually who's the actual buyer and seller of Bitcoin. But Monero is considered an anonymous coin, so it's actually got protections to protect who's the seller in a transaction. That's meaningful because, again, I have to mine these coins. And if I can get free CPU cycles out on the internet, I can make money. And this is actually very real money. Well, if I go steal your social security numbers, I actually have to go sell those, put them on a black market site or something. I have to do something with that. And there's some risk around that. But if I can go hack into your WebLogic server running your PeopleSoft environment and just get the free CPU cycles, I can just put a mining software on there and mine Monero. I can then come back in a month, grab that off, and sell it off. And as you can see, there's $2 billion transacted yesterday. So this was Monero's price yesterday, and you can see this is a dramatic uptick in the price of Monero. Therefore, even today, it's more valuable today to do this than it was yesterday, than it was 6 months ago. And $2 billion transacted yesterday in Monero coins. So again, this is kind of one of the new threats. Somebody may not be after your environment. You may say, I have no valuable data. Yeah, well, today you have valuable things, and it's called CPU cycles. And so they're just hacking into your environments to actually get CPU cycles. So when you're thinking about all the different threats, there's insider threats, outsider threats. Don't always think about the motivation. Try to figure out how to protect your environment versus, hey, nobody wants our environment. They want your CPU cycle. So, and everybody's got that. So let's kind of dive now into the top 10. We're going to go through these systematically and kind of talk about it. And again, this is all over the board. So we're talking about database, we're talking about WebLogic, we're talking about Tuxedo, we're talking about PeopleTools itself. So there's lots of different aspects that you have to be considering when you're thinking about infrastructure security around a PeopleSoft environment. One of the things that we've done is we've taken these top 10 items and actually then mapped it down to what are some of the risks and threats around it. And if you really think about the 4 big risks around a PeopleSoft environment, one would first and foremost be sensitive data loss. So again, someone's coming after your data. They're going to try to steal that data in bulk. The second type of risk is typically around entering of transactions. So one of the big frauds we see is people getting in. If you're doing self-service HR and people can update their bank account number, they can actually go in and hijack, phish one of your employees and actually then go change the bank account number for their direct deposit, and they're stealing money. Otherwise, I may be trying to change the application user password, things like that. Another thing is actually taking someone else's privileges and escalating my privileges. This may be at the application layer. It also may be at the database layer. And then finally, the last one is some form of impact of availability. This may be a phishing attack, which results in holding you hostage, stealing your data. It may be just denial of service, and maybe wiping out your database. So there's lots of different issues here. And again, we mapped these top 10 and trying to map this out to what are some of the key risks? What should you be thinking about in these environments? And then we've kind of taken some of the top issues that can result in data loss, and how do you protect yourself against that? So let's start with the first one. And this is one that is often overlooked in PeopleSoft environments. And we're going to focus in on the Oracle database. Again, if you're running a SQL Server database or some of the other supported databases, very similar issues, but most PeopleSoft environments that we're looking at are very large environments, and therefore they have an Oracle database. The database is often overlooked because there's oftentimes a segregation of duties. There's the DBA, then there's the PeopleSoft administration team. So therefore the database is kind of handled separately. And it's not a direct connection between the DBAs oftentimes and the PeopleSoft application. Yeah, they understand it, they do a good job at it, but they're more kind of doing backups, they're kind of managing it at a lower level, where really there's someone at the PeopleSoft administration side on the PeopleSoft team who's actually doing a lot of the day-to-day, working with WebLogic and P and bring things up and down, and they aren't focused in on the database. The database is very critical to a PeopleSoft environment because that's where the data is. That's where these accounts are. And when you install an Oracle database, you get a set of default accounts. When you install PeopleSoft on top of it, you get a set of accounts. And oftentimes these aren't handled well. There's default passwords. And the problem is that any default password allows me to get into the database and start rummaging around. And if you aren't applying security patches immediately, there's always a potential that I can take over the entire database. Therefore, circumventing any application security controls, anything you've done to protect the application itself, if I can just get into the back end of the database, I can now start querying tables and stealing data pretty quickly. And the problem is there's just not one or two of these. In a typical PeopleSoft environment, when we look at it, there's typically 20 to 75 database accounts. Some of these are the standard accounts, some of these are the PeopleSoft accounts. You're often creating named users, you're creating interfaces and integrations, things like that often have accounts. And so when you create an Oracle database, it creates these accounts often with default passwords. Oracle's gotten much better with 12c and beyond, but depending on when you actually created the database, if you've upgraded the database, there still may be these accounts with default passwords. And the risk here is any of these accounts somebody can get into. And we often see not only is someone targeting a PeopleSoft database, but we often see that they're just targeting databases in general. So when we do our incident response, we often see what happens when an attacker gets on your network. What they'll actually do is scan the internal network looking for Oracle databases. And this is actually pretty easy to do. Then they actually have tools that will then try to connect to all these different database accounts. And they often hit on one. And so if you're kind of looking through the database and you say, hey, I've got 75 accounts, all they need is one. It's not like they're just going after the sys account or the system account or the PS or the sysadm account. They're typically looking for any account to get in. And then if you have kind of not the correct privileges on a single account, and that one happens to have a default password, it's game over at that point. So it's kind of, you have to protect 100%. The hacker only needs to find one mistake out of somewhere typically around 75 accounts. And they already have lists. They already know, and these lists are published out on the internet. So they're actually trying the sysadm account. They're trying your PeopleSoft accounts. They probably aren't trying your custom organizational accounts that you have specific names for, but they know those standard Oracle accounts like DBM, SMP, SysSystem, sysadm, things like that. And so one of the things we do during our security assessments is we actually anonymize the data and actually put it in a small database and actually track when we find default accounts. So this is kind of an example of over the last several years that when we look at default accounts and we brute force the password. So we actually have tools that can go and try millions and millions of combinations against each of these accounts to check if they have a default or weak password. And oftentimes we find accounts with weak passwords. So like DBM SMP, a lot of or DBAs don't change the DBM SMP password. Fortunately, that account doesn't have elevated privileges, but it gives me a door into the database. And if you aren't applying security patches immediately, there's typically a public package that has a security vulnerability. Therefore, I can take over the entire database. So even if an account has low-level privileges, it still is an opportunity for me to get into the database. CTX-SYS, depending on the database version, has elevated privileges, especially in the older versions. And if you've done some upgrades, that account still may have some of those elevated privileges. So one of the things we often see the DBAs aren't doing is checking for default and poor passwords on a regular basis. Oracle gives you a view called DBA users with that password that you need to be using on a very periodic basis, looking for these bad passwords. Unfortunately, DBA users has a number of limitations. One, that it's a limited set of accounts, it's only a single password. So if you create an account based on your company name with the password, DBA users with that password won't find that. So if I create an account with Steve and the password Steve, it won't find that because that's not on its list. There are other tools out there. One example is our tool, AppSentry, which actually will connect to the database and check each database account against 1 million passwords. So, and it can actually do that in 7 seconds. So if you're thinking, oh, this is hard to check these millions and millions of passwords, we check 1 million passwords for each account in 7 seconds. So it's very easy to do to check these accounts, but you do need a tool to do it to actually try to overcome this problem. And we're about a 95% success rate when we do our security assessments of finding at least one account with a default or weak password. And oftentimes it's welcome one, something typically pretty easy. So the first thing you should be doing is looking for those accounts. Well, in the PeopleSoft world, there is actually one that often has a default password. And Oracle doesn't actually recommend you change the password. And that's basically the Connect ID. So when we're talking about the People account with often the password people with a 1 instead of an L, Oracle says, well, this isn't a problem because, again, it has very limited privileges. It's actually meant for this purpose. It's meant for things to connect. The problem is that anytime I can connect to the database, I can take over the database, because if you haven't immediately applied the database security patches, within the database security patches, there's often an update to fix a security vulnerability in one of the public packages. Again, public is assigned to everybody. Public can't be taken away from everybody. So the people account, the Connect ID, has public privileges. So therefore, if I can connect to the database with any account, such as the people account, even though it's very lowly privileged, it's designed to be very secure. Unfortunately, the database isn't that secure, so therefore, if I can connect, I can take over the entire database. So again, this is one of those accounts that even though Oracle doesn't recommend you change the password, you should be changing the password and limiting who can connect to the Connect ID. So kind of the next area is around security patching. Again, I've kind of referenced security patching in the kind of the first two, in that there's a lot of security vulnerabilities in a PeopleSoft environment, especially around the database, especially around PeopleTools, especially around WebLogic and the other components. And when we think about a PeopleSoft environment, this isn't just a little dribble of security vulnerabilities. In the last 15 years, there's been over 500 security vulnerabilities found within, quote, PeopleSoft. And so when I'm saying PeopleSoft here, I'm saying what's labeled under the Critical Patch Update Security Advisory under the PeopleSoft section. Well, that includes PeopleSoft, PeopleTools, Elasticsearch. However, that 503 does not include the database, Tuxedo, WebLogic, or Java. So there's even more. So if you're thinking about your PeopleSoft environment, the entire environment, there's probably over 1,500 security vulnerabilities that have been patched over that time frame. And so each quarter, actually, this number is going up and up and up, typically each quarter. And so each CPU release, so in January, think about it, there's probably 26 security vulnerabilities that were vulnerable in your environment when we add up the 8 in PeopleSoft, the several that were in WebLogic. Again, not every single WebLogic vulnerability is applicable to every WebLogic environment, because there's a lot of third-party components as part of that. But again, think about 26 vulnerabilities in a typical PeopleSoft environment, running an Oracle database, running WebLogic, and in addition with Elasticsearch. And this doesn't even include Java, because again, when you're thinking about Java within a PeopleSoft environment, there's actually between 6 and 12 Java homes. So are you patching every single one of those? Are those actually vulnerable? Are those accessible and things like that? So patching is not this simple thing. So when you start thinking about it, you actually have to go through, and there's actually a number of different patches, and we see that some organizations do better job at others. Some organizations just pick and choose. Some are able to get all these patches in a very short time. Some organizations don't even get any of these patches in. I can't tell you how many times we do a security assessment and they haven't applied a security patch in 12 months. But again, this is not an easy task. Anyone who's attempted to go through this is, again, you're having to patch the application, you're having to do PeopleTools, the database, Tuxedo, WebLogic. There's a lot to do here. And so kind of as we go through this presentation, I'm going to actually highlight a few of these in different areas to say, hey, maybe prioritize the WebLogic patches because there is a little bit more importance to that. Maybe downgrade the Java patches because, again, that's not as important. But again, if you've got a lot of ad hoc database user access, the database patches become more important. While the PeopleTools patches are more difficult to apply than other patches. So we see a lot of organizations actually applying Tuxedo and WebLogic, but they're not applying the PeopleTools. Again, there's vulnerabilities at every layer here that are important, and just depending on the quarter, depending on the security vulnerability, there may be an issue. So a lot of the recommendations we'll actually have throughout this presentation is how to actually limit the impact of these security vulnerabilities. Well, if someone can't get to a component like Tuxedo, well, there's no actually issue, because if I can only connect to Tuxedo from the database and from the PIA web server, well, I don't have as much of an issue. Can I do that in my environment? Am I using Application Designer? What's going on? How can I limit that? If I can't connect to the database, if I have Bastion host set up for the database, things like that, well, having database patches isn't important. Am I external? Am I internal? That all drives what's important in these security patches. So when you think about critical patch updates, applying them on a regular basis, again, that's the easy recommendation. I love to make that recommendation because everyone says, yeah, it's a lot easier said than done. Yes, but again, the business needs to be prioritizing this. And again, we're reducing the risk of compromise, we're reducing the escalation of privileges by applying these on a regular basis. When you think about the security vulnerabilities, think about what is my risk? Where is my greatest risk? Again, there's always an inside risk. You should never underestimate the internal risk because, again, there's always phishing attacks. Internal networks are often compromised. But when you actually then expose PeopleSoft externally, and a lot of organizations do that, that is now opening it up to a very different risk than saying on my internal network. We've always, people often say, okay, well, the internal risk and the external risk are equal. That's not true. If you have PeopleSoft exposed externally, that is dramatically, significantly more risk than if it's just internal. Again, internal, I can count up how many people are on my network. Somebody has to compromise in my internal network to cause a problem. But again, as soon as I expose PeopleSoft externally, I have now opened it up to the 2 billion people on the internet. There's 2 billion people that possibly can now connect to it and do something bad. That's very different. Well, database security patches aren't dependent on the other patches. So depending on your organization, if you have a lot of ad hoc database users, well, database security patches may be important, may not be important. So if you do have lots of ad hoc database users, again, anyone can take over the entire database with just public permissions. And those aren't dependent on the other patches. So a lot of organizations say we have to apply all these patches at once. That's not true. There is not much overlap within the security patches across the different technology stack components. So a lot of organizations say, well, we can't apply the PeopleTools patch now. Well, we got the WebLogic in, but we're going to do the database when we do the PeopleTools. Well, the database patches have no dependency on anything else, so you can apply those immediately. So just depending on your organization where you're trying to fit these in, it may be important to apply some now, some later, and try to really look at the risk. And again, this changes somewhat each quarter, but not dramatically. And when we talk about security patches, again, some of that is actually driven by direct database access. So if I have lots of direct database access and I'm giving user accounts out to my super users, people like that need to connect, or actually have a lot of interfaces and I'm giving it out to developers, I might have some read-only accounts. I can't tell you how often we find in a PeopleSoft database account like PS read only, HR read only, something like that, that is giving people access to a large segment of data. And oftentimes it's select any table as the system privilege granted out, which is way too much privilege. And then it's not controlled because, again, it's a generic account. It's handed out like candy throughout the organization. It gets shared. I have a hard time changing the password to lock it down occasionally, things like that. So again, I'm now increasing my risk with these direct database accounts because, again, if someone can connect and I haven't applied security patches, they can take over the entire database. And there's oftentimes, we often see issues also within these privileges granted. Well, one of those people needs a little bit more access. And depending on what the privileges are, we often see like a create public synonym granted out. Well, if you grant somebody create public synonym, they can actually hijack standard packages in the database, redirect it to them, and actually then take over the entire database. So there's lots of even granular privileges that make it very easy for someone to escalate their privileges within the database. So anyone who connects to the database should be considered a potential threat to the overall database and should be reviewing who has what privileges and how they can access the database. The problem is when we actually talk about reviewing direct database access, it's not an easy task. And the question is, who's going to do it? You've got the DBAs who actually probably understand a little bit what's going on, but they don't know who these people are, what their business requirements are. You may have some auditors coming in from maybe IT audit, internal audit. Well, they don't really know databases, so they can't really evaluate the process. The PeopleSoft team, well, those probably aren't database people. So again, this often falls in the cracks. And so first, it's kind of time consuming to do this. Second is who's got the best expertise to do it? Who can understand the PeopleSoft data model, what customizations you have, what interfaces, why someone should be doing this, what's the business rationale? There is a nice new feature within the Oracle database that's been released as part of 11G, and now it's been actually included as part of the enterprise edition. So if you do want to know who's accessing what, there's actually something called privilege analysis. So you can actually turn on this feature for certain database accounts and you can actually see what they're doing within the database. What privileges are they using? So if you see accounts with way too many privileges, you can turn on privilege analysis for a month or two, figure out what they're doing and take away those excess privileges. So if you want to kind of get away some of this issue, get away from some of the database patching issues, one is our number one security recommendation around PeopleSoft is if you want to protect the database, limit direct access to the database. If people can't connect to the database, it's very hard to hack an Oracle database. Again, I have to go through the application. So if I don't have these ad hoc accounts, I don't have all this direct database access, my system is actually much more secure. Many organizations have flat networks, so their databases are just on their internal network, and everyone on the internal network can connect to it. If you've got 10,000 nodes on your internal network, do 10,000 nodes need to connect to the Oracle database that's supporting PeopleSoft? Probably not. If I can limit that access, I've dramatically reduced my risk. I can do things like actually have bastion hosts. So if the DBAs need to direct connect, I don't know necessarily where they're coming from. Well, they have a bastion host. They have to go through this Windows terminal service, the Citrix server to actually connect. That now gives me a lot more control about what's happening. It's reducing the risk, reducing the possibility that someone can get in. So that covers kind of some of the key issues, especially around the database. We kind of talked about security patches, but in the database quite a bit. One of the big areas that you really need to be thinking about is around the WebLogic WebSphere, the external deployment. WebLogic is actually a great product. It works really well. It's very feature rich. From a security perspective, being feature rich is actually a bad thing. Because again, there's lots in there. There's lots of possible issues. There's lots of additional features and functionality that's not needed in a PeopleSoft environment. It shouldn't be running. However, it's all turned on by default. When you install WebLogic, you get a lot of stuff there, a lot of unused, unnecessary features that are just enabled. When you install WebLogic as part of the DBK or whatever, it's there. These things are fully accessible. And now if you deploy it to the internet, this is available on the internet. So when we talk about the console, the WebLogic console, I can't tell you how many, when we look at external deployments of PeopleSoft, the WebLogic console is available on the internet. There is no reason that someone should be able to connect your WebLogic console from the internet. And when we talk about these, it becomes an issue because if there's a security vulnerability in that component, it becomes a significant challenge in the environment because it's not needed. Why is it there? But by the way, someone can get into it. So when you're deploying externally especially, you need to be very careful about what can be accessible. And if you actually go through the WebLogic request logs, you can see what's being used. And when we talk about URLs that are accessible, servlets, functionality accessible in WebLogic, there's about 100 different URLs. If you look at the URL in your browser when you're actually accessing your PeopleSoft environment, you won't see 100. You'll see very distinct patterns, and it'll start with like PS, PSP, PSC. You won't see council, you won't see monitor, you won't see WLS, WSAT, you won't see XML link. Those aren't used. However, there's 100 of those that are used, and each of those maps to a specific little functionality called a servlet behind the scenes in WebLogic. If there's a security vulnerability in one of those servlets, that becomes a security vulnerability as part of the critical patch update. Someone can get into your environment. Well, they can't get into your environment if you've already blocked it. It's like if a tree falls in the wood and nobody hears it, it's kind of like a security vulnerability. If I can't access that piece of functionality, it's patched already. It's virtually patched. And so one of the things you should be doing is, especially on external deployments, is locking down in the load balancer, the reverse proxy, the list of URLs that can be accessed. And this list, you'll be shocked on how small this list becomes, because the way PeopleSoft works is it funnels everything through just a couple servlets that provide all the functionality. And so when we're talking about actual URLs in the base URL, I'm talking about the PS part, the PSP part, there's only a couple of those in most environments. And if you actually go through the request logs, you'll see that there's actually very, very few. Another option is implementing a tool like our tool called AppDefend. It's a web application firewall. It's a protection layer for the application, and it's specifically designed to block these URLs and block the stuff that's not used, as well as providing virtual patches for the security vulnerabilities and also protecting against classes of security vulnerabilities. So most of our clients who run AppDefend and PeopleSoft actually were already virtually patched for every single security vulnerability as part of the CPU January 2021. So not even having to update the product with new rules because there's new security vulnerabilities, we're already blocking all this just stuff out there that was impacted by the security vulnerabilities. So it's kind of very important. It's like, how can you be proactive? If you want to get off the hamster wheel of security patches, block this stuff ahead of time. Therefore, no one can access it. Therefore, the security patches become secondary. You don't have to be on, hey, we have to get this in, especially for our external environment, as quickly as possible. So I'll jump into one example here. So last October, Oracle patched a very critical security vulnerability within the WebLogic console. Well, especially externally, if you had already blocked the WebLogic console, you weren't actually even impacted externally. Well, internally, you were probably still allowing it, but externally, you weren't even allowing it, so therefore you wouldn't be subject to this vulnerability. Again, this was a 9.8. And so the vulnerability was actually multiple vulnerabilities strung together. And so what happened was Oracle actually published and fixed vulnerability 1 and 2, and then it actually had to go back and fix it again because they made a mistake in their fix. So there's 3 vulnerabilities all related to the WebLogic console. 1 and 2 worked together. 3 was actually a fix for number 1 because they didn't actually quite fix it right the first time. So again, you're relying on Oracle's patches, right? Well, Oracle's not even getting their patches right on the security side. So why even allow the WebLogic console? That was just unneeded functionality. This wasn't a security vulnerability in the core of PeopleSoft. This was just in something that was externally deployed accidentally by mistake that Oracle just has turned on. And if they say, oh, there's not an issue with it, oh, actually there was a big issue in it. And that's kind of what you need to be thinking about. Why deploy something when you don't need to? And so quickly go through this vulnerability, and what it was there's the 2 vulnerabilities work together. The first vulnerability was an authorization bypass. So I could actually access things within the WebLogic console without actually typing in the password. So typically the password is I go in and it's a system and password with a 0 instead of an O. Was the default password. So I can bypass that authentication of the WebLogic console and I can do different things in it. Well, then there was actually a second vulnerability, which then allows me, if I had authentication, to do what's called a remote code authentication or execution, which allows me to actually execute things at the operating system layer. So these two vulnerabilities together allow me to take over the entire PA web server. Well, the third vulnerability was actually to fix the first vulnerability because they actually didn't fix it completely. So this is, you're relying on the security patches to keep you protected. Hopefully you're applying them as quickly as possible, but oh, by the way, the security patches aren't always 100%. Therefore, if you just blocked this, you would have been much better off. And kind of, you'll get a copy of this presentation. So here's kind of the URL. So this wasn't actually that difficult to exploit because if you can see, if I just put some special characters in the URLs, I can actually bypass the authentication. And then this second part is basically, if I do a special Java class and I just put this in, I can now execute things at the operating system layer. So you can see this was actually, they used it because Oracle Coherence is also installed as part of the WebLogic console. I could actually leverage a functionality in the Oracle Coherence. Again, another piece that's too much installed. You're not running Oracle Coherence on your WebLogic, but oh, by the way, the Oracle Coherence console administration functions are actually installed, even though you're not running it, it's still installed. Therefore, I was able to leverage a piece of that code to actually take over the WebLogic console, take over the operating system, take over the entire server. And typically what people were doing was we're actually taking over WebLogic servers and actually doing Monero Bitcoin mining on those servers. So again, this is how it all works together. Depending on how you're deployed, either single server or multi-server, is how you protect this. So if you, again, if I'm running externally, just block access to console. It's done, I'm protected. Internally, now I have to do actually a little bit more work. If I'm on a multi-server domain, I can actually do this and actually put in filters within the console that force the console to only be accessible by different devices. Unfortunately, I can't do that for the single server implementation because it will actually block access to the application too. But just depending on how I want this set up, how I actually have my PeopleSoft environment configured for either single server or multi-server, it depends on what I want to protect. But then again, there's three other protocols that are enabled as part of the WebLogic console. So I should be blocking that too. And so I include all the meta-link notes here. So as you can see, a lot of the discussion here is block things you don't need. Block down, reduce the surface area, protect the application before there's an actual issue. That becomes very important. And kind of there's more discussion around, hey, how do I do these connection filters? How do I block it down to a limited set of IP addresses, potentially only a local host, block everyone else from accessing all this way too much information? And again, depending on what you're doing, if you're using WebLogic scripting, I may need access to this. I may need access from a limited set of IP addresses. So a lot of this configuration is very specific to how you manage your PeopleSoft environment, what you're doing in the environment. But again, you can lock this stuff down really well if you spend a little bit of time and effort and really dramatically reduce the risk of a security attack or breach. So one of the interesting things about these WebLogic vulnerabilities was that there was a large number of security researchers who jumped in on this. And this was all kind of from last year, and a couple more security vulnerabilities got released as part of the January CPU, but WebLogic got a lot of attention here. So we're actually anticipating more activity around WebLogic, more security vulnerabilities being found in the future. So again, this isn't something that, hey, it got fixed once and it's going to be done moving forward. You need to be thinking about these WebLogic issues and kind of really focus in on the WebLogic, because that's where people are looking at, researching, publishing information now. And this is a good, if you're a security researcher, you want to get credit for these bugs, get them published out. It makes you look good as a security researcher and then harms every WebLogic customer out there. So again, this is not going to be the end of it. We anticipate kind of over the next year some very critical bugs coming out in WebLogic. So anything you can do to lock down the WebLogic, especially if you're running externally, is very important. Kind of now jumping on to, let's talk about a little bit about encryption and networking. So by default, PeopleSoft doesn't turn on encryption of network traffic. Again, it's very important that you're encrypting this traffic, because again, when someone connects to the PeopleSoft application and they type in their password, that password is unencrypted across the network. So this is one of the ways to actually protect the data that's actually going across the network, sensitive data. If you type in a social security number, it's traversing the network. Well, if these people are coming in across the internet, who's intercepting that traffic? Who can see that traffic? Most people actually do encrypt this, do turn it on. What we see oftentimes is it's encrypted externally, but not internally. But again, it should be encrypted everywhere whenever possible. The second part of it is it configured? Most people are now have it configured, but the protocols and ciphers that are enabled, and especially by default within the PeopleSoft environment, are actually weak. Is this a huge deal? No. One of the reasons we include this is we want you to have good security scans as well as anything else. So a lot of the security scanners, if you're actually having your IT security team scan your PeopleSoft environment, they're coming up and actually hopefully squawking about this, that you've actually got these older, weaker protocols enabled. What's the probability if you're running TLS version 1.1 and someone's intercepting your traffic across the internet and they're actually able to decrypt it? Probably not great. If you're running SSL version 3, yes, they can actually decrypt that. But if you're running TLS version 1.1, they're probably going to move on pretty quickly versus trying to hack your traffic and do something with it. But again, if you've got security scans going on, TLS version 1.1 is what should be running, and that should be the only one running. And then around ciphers, again, you've got protocols and ciphers on how all the encryption works. There's a number of weak ciphers enabled by default in the PeopleSoft environment. Those should actually be very carefully looked at, and those that are older, deprecated ones should be removed. A great way to test this is, especially if you're running externally, there is a site called sslabs.com. You type in your address. There is a little checkbox there that says save the results or don't. Please check don't save the results, because otherwise you'll show up on their boards that say, hey, you got an A+ or a F-. So, but you can easily check your configuration. So if you are running this, you should be doing this. When we talk about things that aren't used in a PeopleSoft environment, PeopleSoft Performance Monitor, PPM, is typically not used by many organizations, but it's there. If you type in your PeopleSoft URL/monitor, it pops up right away. Oh, by the way, there was a really bad Java decentralization vulnerability in October 2017, which again, let me take over the PA web server. Let me execute commands at the operating system layer. Again, it's not used. Why is it available? Why is it accessible? There's two parts to this. One is enabled or disabled, and two is I can get to it. Well, are there security vulnerabilities? Even if you disable it, can I connect to it? Yes. In this one vulnerability here, I could potentially still exploit the vulnerability even if it was disabled. The key is, well, I should be blocking it. If it's not used, I should block it. I should be blocking this and filtering this URL either at my reverse proxy, my load balancer, at that layer. I shouldn't be relying on having to go in and actually disable PPM, because some of these security vulnerabilities, even if I disable it, so somewhere in the code, and what happens typically is in line 100 of the code, it says, oh, if disabled, don't do anything. By the way, there's lots of other processing happening before it hits that line. And it's not like the first line says, hey, if it's disabled, don't do anything. It kind of does some stuff. It looks at your session. It kind of goes through a bunch of stuff. And then finally it gets to, hey, you need to execute a command. Oh, is it enabled or disabled? So the security vulnerabilities oftentimes in many of these servlets that are not used by many people, and there's a number of servlets out there that are actually PeopleSoft 8 servlets that are no longer used in a PeopleSoft 9 environment. They're still accessible. They're still fully operational, and the security vulnerability is before that point where it actually runs, before the point where it says, hey, this functionality is no longer used, just stop processing. The security vulnerability is before that. The PPM vulnerability, in this case, was that case. We've looked through this servlet pretty closely. We don't think there's another one in it, but hey, again, there may be. So therefore, if you're not using this, it should definitely be blocked. Another example around this is Tuxedo. Well, if you're using Tuxedo, the Java service listener is only used between the PA web server and Tuxedo. It's not used for anything else. So there's no reason anyone should be doing it. And oh, by the way, there were some very critical security vulnerabilities in Tuxedo back in 2017 that let me just dump the memory from it and see what was going on the Tuxedo server. So again, another example, if you don't need it, block it. If only certain systems need access to it, only allow those systems, and that's fully enabled. You can actually do that within Tuxedo very easily. However, you have to set it up. It doesn't come by default. I can also encrypt those connections. I can also do a number of settings here. And if you're not using it, again, the workstation service listener is used by things like application designer, etc. If I'm not using that in production, disable it. I don't need that vulnerability because again, if I disable it, no one can access it. Therefore, even if a vulnerability comes out tomorrow, I'm not at risk for it. So a lot of these things are, hey, turn things off you don't need, block access to things you don't need, restrict access as much as possible, therefore reducing the risk dramatically. And again, the Jolt listener. And the interesting thing about the way Tuxedo works within the PeopleSoft environment is Tuxedo as a standalone, if you implemented Tuxedo today for your custom application, you would put protections and authentication around Tuxedo. The way PeopleSoft uses Tuxedo is different. It runs the transaction and then checks authentication. If you were doing this for a custom application, you wouldn't do it that way. You would first check the authentication and then run the transaction. The way it's implemented within PeopleSoft is that doesn't work. So it's got this capability to actually do a domain connection password and have some authentication. Unfortunately, PeopleSoft by default doesn't do that. It assumes that it's a valid transaction is coming in and then it checks the authentication. So if there is a problem like this jolt and bleed vulnerability, I can still execute all these transactions, even though then it's checking for the authentication. It'll say, hey, you're not authorized to execute this transaction. However, it's not saying, hey, you can't even connect to me unless you authenticate to me. That's the default in Tuxedo. However, that's not the default the way PeopleSoft uses it. You can turn that on. So even if I'm trying to connect to it, I still have that authentication. I can also restrict IP addresses. So again, I'm locking it down, and these are the instructions on how to actually lock down Tuxedo to limit the access to who can actually access it, to limit my exposure from a security perspective. And again, disable WSL if you're not using it in production. You can check the logs to see actually who's connecting, is it used? And again, it's typically run by default. People have it enabled. Again, if I can connect and there's a security vulnerability, I can take it over. The next area where we often see issues is that there's no database or application auditing. For some reason, a lot of people just don't like to turn on auditing. I will caveat every discussion here around auditing is, yes, if you turn on too much, it will impact performance. However, if you selectively choose and not audit high volume transactions, auditing will not cause a problem. Yes, you can shoot yourself in the foot very easily by turning on too much auditing either at the database level or the application level. But if you're auditing very specific low volume events like everyone connecting sessions, things like that, you can have a very good, robust audit trail so you can understand what's happening in the environment. Without auditing, you don't understand what's happening in the environment, who's using what, who's connecting when, what malicious users are connecting, when an attacker is connecting. That's the information you need to understand what's happening in the environment. And between the database, WebLogic, Tuxedo, and PeopleSoft and PeopleTools, you've got the auditing capabilities. Unfortunately, again, all those layers you must turn on auditing on individually. PeopleTools does have some very good auditing capabilities. However, you have to be very aware of when you turn on auditing at different layers, what is it actually auditing? So field level auditing is only looking at some of the base changes and things that are happening within the PeopleSoft GUI. It's not auditing if I go in a SQL Plus or SQL Developer and actually do a direct table update, that may not be audited by some of the PeopleSoft, PeopleTools audits, where I may need to turn on database auditing to get actually, if I need to know everything happening to a certain table, I may have to do a trigger. I may have to then create shadow audit tables and capture that information. So be very aware, what are you trying to audit? Why are you auditing it? And is there ways around that audit trail? Because again, there's lots of different auditing capabilities within between the database and PeopleTools, be very aware what you're turning on and why. And then again, there's lots of different audit trails. So the great thing is there's lots of great audit trail capabilities within the PeopleSoft environment. However, there's lots of different ways to do the same thing. So you may have to turn on multiple audits to get a full breadth of information that you want. Some of it may overlap, some of it may not. So you have to probably turn on 4 or 5 different things. This is one of the things that our AppsEntry tool does, is it actually pulls in the database audit trail, it pulls in the PeopleSoft audit trail. So it's pulling in all that audit trail from all the different layers and correlating it all together. So it's very important when you're thinking about the audit is have a framework, go through and spend some time trying to figure out what I want to audit, what I need to do. So if you want all logins, well, oftentimes the auditors say, I want all logins. Well, is that PeopleSoft logins? Is that database logins? Is that logins to WebLogic console? So there's lots of different places people log in, and all those are separate audit trails that need to be enabled individually. There are different capabilities within PeopleSoft to actually capture some additional detailed information. So one of the things that you want to make sure is enabled, and this should be enabled by default in the latest PeopleTools versions. However, depending on upgrades, we actually have seen it not enabled in older versions. So there's actually an enabled DB monitoring capability that one of the issues that always comes up is, hey, I'm capturing a database audit trail, but it's just capturing that the sysadm user is doing something. It's not telling me that actually the application user. You can actually capture that information within the database audit trail, and it's captured in a field called client info. And if it's enabled within the application will actually send in the end user application name to the database audit trail. So you can actually see if you have to actually have a specific audit on like a PS person table, something like that. I can actually see what end user was actually querying that table, even though at the database level it was only the sysadm user was doing millions and millions of transactions in the database. I can actually also have it annotate and add in the end user of the application. So kind of one of those things, again, this gets down to a very specific compliance security requirements, but again, if you need this turned on, this feature is there and capable. So finally, number 10 here is let's talk about sensitive data for a second. Again, you're putting a lot of very sensitive data often in a PeopleSoft environment. Is it protected? And there's different ways you can protect it. It can be when it's actually at rest, when it's sitting on your disk, when it's on the backup tapes. Is it accessible? So if someone signs into the database, when they try to access that data, is it still encrypted? And then also on the network, when it's moving around your network. Many organizations use Oracle's transparent data encryption. If you're using Microsoft SQL Server, there's also transparent data encryption. Both products have the same name and function very similarly. A lot of organizations rely on Oracle TD to actually encrypt the data for them. It's very important to understand what TD does and what TD doesn't do. TD is a very good product that encrypts the data at rest. So if I lose a disk drive, a database file, someone hacks into the operating system and grabs my database files, or I lose a backup tape, my data is fully encrypted. And as long as I'm not backing up the Oracle wallets with that, I'm fairly well protected. However, the second someone signs in the database, they never see the data encrypted because it's transparent. As soon as someone's logged into the database, they see the data fully unencrypted. So we've been in organizations that we ask, okay, let's look at social security numbers, let's look at some of the sensitive data, salary information, personal identifiable information, those types of things. And the CIO says, yeah, no, all our data is encrypted. Well, we go in and we find an issue, we kind of get quickly into the database. We're like, yeah, no, we can see all the data. It's like, I've been told it was all encrypted because they're running Oracle TD, and that's what management says. Hey, it's all encrypted because we bought Oracle TD, we spent a lot of money. But by the way, it's not a full 100% solution. You have to be very aware of that. So within PeopleSoft, it's there. You can fully encrypt all the PeopleSoft data at the disk level. And we actually recommend using tablespace encryption. Try to avoid column encryption because, again, there's lots of different elements. It's scattered throughout the database. It tends to be tedious to figure out what columns are actually the best ones to encrypt. So if you use tablespace encryption, performance usually is never an impact. Oracle's doing a good job. The encryption routines are now in the silicon, so it actually works fairly well. So again, TD works. It should be implemented as much as possible. Try to go towards table space encryption. But again, as soon as you sign on, it's not encrypted. So you just have to be aware of that. Or PeopleTools has some additional encryption technologies that you can implement. Again, this is a case by case. What do you need to do? What do you need to turn on and things like that. So I will turn it back over to Scott and see if we have any questions.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. And certainly want to remind everyone that if you do have any questions, you can put those in the questions section of the control panel. So let me see what we got here. Okay, first question. If you really could only do a few of these, I'm assuming they mean patches, what would be the most important?
Yeah, so kind of on the top 10 here, if I had to focus in on a few, if you're running externally, the WebLogic is exceptionally important. And probably second is spending some time around the database, because when we've done PeopleSoft audits and assessments, we often find a lot of problems around the database because it just hasn't been a focus. That they may have done segregation of duties well, they may have locked down a lot of things within the application, within PeopleTools, and done a good job at that. We often see a number of findings at the database level that aren't consistent with other aspects of the entire environment. So make sure that the database is done well. But again, that WebLogic externally is top priority. That's the area, if you don't sleep at night, I would be thinking about it. I would probably be staying up thinking about it. But then the database side is one area that we actually see more vulnerabilities, more issues than should be in a PeopleSoft environment, because you can actually lock that down fairly well.
Okay. Next question I see here, for Monero mining, what would we usually see on the server?
Typically on the WebLogic servers, you would see high CPU utilization. So if you're monitoring your servers for CPU, you would either see large spikes, or the tools allow you to actually set a CPU level. And so oftentimes what they do is they actually set it at like 40%. And so that's not enough to throw up any alarm bells, not enough to throw any triggers. But if you actually look at your external WebLogic servers and you actually see them all pegged at 40 or 50%, that's probably what's happening. Because again, they should be bouncing around quite a bit. But if you see them kind of flatlined at 45 to 55% constantly, that seems to be what kind of a key indicator. They should be just bouncing around. You should see them dipping at night. But if you see constant CPU performance day and night, that's typically you've been compromised and someone's mining Bitcoin or Monero on your servers.
Okay. And let's see, this one just popped in, and it might have to be the last one, and that's auditing turned on various layers potentially results in a performance degradation. Is there any way to optimize?
So it's really spending time and just turning on what you need and spending some time thinking about it. You're not going to be able to audit every query happening against sensitive data. That's kind of the areas that become problematic. If you think about auditing, look at for key security events. Who's accessing the database? Who's accessing the application? What are they accessing within the application? Spend some time going through that. Who's accessing what fields? But to turn on database audits that access and log every single query against certain tables that are high volume tables will cause a performance issue. So you can turn on a significant amount of auditing, get a significant amount of information without any performance issues. But again, if someone says, oh, we need every single change in the database with every single access to every single sensitive table, that's going to cause a problem. But you can get 95% of the way down your auditing, your compliance and security requirements by turning on a very robust set of audits without causing any performance issues. It's just that last couple percent that there may be one requirement there, and there's typically other ways you can get around that.
Okay, I'll tell you what, let's try to sneak one more in there, and that's we can't apply security patches due to business and technical constraints. What should we do?
So again, virtual patching, like with our App Defend tool, is very meaningful there, because again, we're virtually patching the web application. So we have some organizations who can't apply security patches and they use our App Defend product as a mitigating control. At the database layer, limiting access to the database as much as possible to only DBAs using Bastion hosts. And the Tuxedo server, limiting access, you can limit access to the Tuxedo server. So in a very well-controlled environment, you could get to the point where security vulnerabilities are not exploitable and you're not applying patches by limiting access, applying some virtual patching solutions like App Defend, and you can get to the point where you don't have to apply security patches. But again, that takes a lot of work and effort, and we always recommend applying the security patches, but you can get pretty far down the road to eliminating almost all the risk around the security patches by limiting access, having a virtual patching solution on the web front end.
Awesome. Okay, well, Steve, we are a couple minutes over time. Do you have any parting thoughts before we wrap everything up?
No, sounds good. Thank you everyone for attending.
Okay, well, excellent. Well, thank you, Steve. Certainly appreciate the presentation. Security for PeopleSoft is obviously not far from our hearts, so we are very, very thrilled that Integrigy was able to join the summit. As Steve is showing right there, we have some upcoming educational events to ensure that are on your calendar. These are all events that Appsian participates in. Some great opportunities to do additional thought leadership and do some additional networking. These are obviously through HEUG, HIUG, Quest, and OHUG. Lastly, I would like to mention that the next PeopleSoft Innovation Summit is currently being planned, so keep your eyes towards an email on Friday. You should be getting a survey on this particular summit. We'd love to get your response and let us know what you would like to see in future summits. We'd also encourage you to follow Appsian on LinkedIn and Twitter. You can certainly get quick event details from those channels. And then we do have the official PSFTSummit Slack channel that we're seeing some pretty cool conversations happening in. You can find that at psftsummit.slack.com. And we will be back here in about 10 minutes. The next session is Achieving PeopleSoft Accessibility, Going Beyond Overlays and Widgets. That will close us out for the day. And then we will be, of course, back at it tomorrow. But we will see you guys back here in 10 minutes. Stick around. Bye-bye.